sorry.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. How are you? Welcome. I'm Adrienne Brodeur. I'm the director of Aspen Words, along with Jamie Kravitz, who's in the audience. And this lovely gentleman to my left is Jonathan Wells, who has been a longtime supporter of Aspen Words and a former board member, as well as the author of 2 poetry collections, Train Dance and The Man with Many Pens. And Jonathan is here tonight to introduce the astonishing Tracy K. Smith, our poet laureate. But before I get on to all that fabulousness, we have to make some thank yous to some very important people in the audience. So if you'll bear with me as I go through this list, I'd like you to hold your applause to the end. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank our season presenting sponsors, Beth and Josh Mondry, Helen and Wally Obermeyer, as well as the grantors, the City of Aspen, Les Dames d'Aspen, the Thrift Shop of Aspen, our media partners, Aspen Sojourner, the Aspen Times, Aspen Public Radio, Aspen 82, and finally our host partners, Aspen Alps, Edible Aspen, Aspen Skiing Company, Four Mountain Sports, and the Isberian Rug Company. So please help me thank all these wonderful partners. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Aspen Words would not be able to do the good work that we do without the support of every single person in this room. And it is you who love poetry and storytelling and literature and the very important conversations that they engender and inspire that is really the heartbeat of this organization. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrienne. Good evening, poetry lovers, lovers of literature, and so wonderful to see so many people come out on a cold night. I am thrilled to introduce Tracy Smith because although we've never met until this evening, we've had this sort of strange, slightly telepathic relationship. For the last 2 years, a friend who teaches a class at Princeton called Music versus Lyrics has invited me to be a guest lecturer. I thought it would be interesting in my lecture to look at the planet Mars from the perspective of Tracy Smith's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Life on Mars, and David Bowie's song by the same title, especially since he is featured in the collection. And that seemed to fit the mission of the class, although I was given absolutely no direction. I spent a long time reading and listening to Life on Mars. What struck me about the two was how different they were without being incompatible. Bowie's idea of Mars in the song is a kind of a plaintive, slightly yearning for this utopian place, a relief from human pressures and foibles, a panacea. Tracy's was hopeful, big-hearted, and human. There were people out there, and not just any people. Mars was inhabited by those she knew and loved her back, including David Bowie, with his shining eyes, and her father, who had shared with her his love of outer space. It is this relationship that she explores in the book and animates it. As I read the collection again, I thought of lines Philip Larkin used in his poem Ambulances. Larkin, who was death-obsessed, refers in the poem to, quote, the solving emptiness that lies under all we do. For Tracy, the emptiness of space offers qualities other than despair. In her book, I feel a sense of its connectedness, and community and touch, a place occupied by people in some way like us, but maybe better. In her poem, Everything That Ever Was, she writes, like a wide wake rippling infinitely into the distance, everything that ever was still is somewhere, floating near the surface, nursing its hunger for you and me, and the now we've named and made a place of. When my Princeton friend invited me back, he asked me if I'd like to meet Tracy and tell her what my views were of Mars and contrasting ideas and so on and so forth. And I said, oh, please, no. I could just imagine how comfortable I would have felt if a stranger was launching theories about my book and family to a room full of strangers. By now, she may be used to it. I hope so. So it is my honor to introduce you to Tracy Smith, our Poet Laureate. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a lovely few days in Aspen. I hope not my only visit to this wonderful place. On the ride over here, I discovered that Jamie, I don't know where she's sitting, grew up in Northern California, where I also grew up, and that we went to the same camp, which happens to be called Camp Whiskey Town. And I've written a little bit about that experience in my memoir, and so I thought it might be nice to start with that. It also, looking over these pages tonight, I realized this is kind of an origin story in a way. This was my, if in some ways my work is death-obsessed or interested in that other side, this might be one of the reasons for that. And I'll just start out by saying the memoir is a book that's thinking about my experience of family and my mother in particular, whom I lost when I was 22. It's also a book that has a lot to do with interrogating the sense of faith that I grew up with and finding a place of synthesis between what my mother believed and what made sense to me in my own vocabulary. There's a little bit of that tension even in this early chapter. Our campground sat at the center of more wide open space than I'd ever seen before, all of it framed by forests of oak and pines. Each morning, the whole group of us played soccer and read Rover in a field. Thick fog hovered out across the horizon while the sun was still low. There were gophers popping up from their tunnels and beavers swimming in the river, their oily, wet fur glistening in the sun. As the day progressed to a cloudless, clear blue, small groups of us were led on hikes up and down mountain trails. At our guide's instruction, we tasted wild green onions. They grew in bunches and were just as thin as blades of grass, only taller. We crossed running streams, stepping rock to rock. I was frightened to near paralysis by things like walking across logs or climbing down steep, muddy grades, and fell into step in the rear of the pack, hoping to amass the courage while my classmates ahead of me made their way. More than once, my apprehension caused our guide to have to backtrack and help me over whatever small hurdle had gotten the better of me. It was a humiliation, but its sting was still less than the fear I felt at nearly every turn. When my feet got wet and I spent a good part of the day uncomfortably cold, I tried to remind myself that it was nothing short of a miracle that I was there in the first place, nothing shy of an act of God to have been allowed to throw my sleeping bag in with the rest of my class and ride off into a week of more or less self-supervision. Were my parents worried about me up there on my own? 2 days before our time at Whiskeytown was over, our 4 teachers and the camp director stood before us in the cafeteria. It was dark out, and the fire was crackling, reinvigorating the wood smoke smell. Oh, I have to back up and say this was a class trip, and I was too shy to shower in the communal showers, so I thought I would save up all my showers for when I got home. So this is what you're going to hear, like reinvigorating the wood smoke smell that had seeped into the molecules of my hair, clothes, and unwashed skin. "We have a very serious announcement to make," Mr. Samuels said. He was bearded, with ruddy cheeks and a round face, which he just then was keeping perfectly free of expression. "You may already have heard some rumors, but we wanted to be the ones to tell you that one of your classmates, Kenny Moffett, died this morning." Mr. Samuels paused a moment to give our gasps and murmurs time to sound out, though for the most part the room remained silent. My thoughts froze and sped up at the same time. Kenny, the boy I sat beside every day in class, bickering with and making mischief, the boy with the dirty fingernails and the freckle-spattered face. I'd barely seen him since we arrived. It was almost as though I'd expected him still to be sitting there in the darkened classroom, waiting beside my empty desk, though of course class with its chalkboards and corkboards and windows looking out onto the harbor of our schoolyard now seemed a million miles away. I didn't know what to think or do, so I sat there willing my ears to listen. "Kenny had a mild heart condition," Mr. Samuels continued. He said it like this was knowledge he had had for a long time. "He suffered a heart attack this morning while he and a classmate were out jogging." I could gather who the classmate had been. Ellis, the kid who resembled Andrew Jackson, was Kenny's best friend. The 2 of them were funny together, working up little comic bits worthy of the Marx Brothers or Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, whom they had studied enough to imitate with a fair degree of accuracy, at least for 9-year-olds. I liked those movies too, for what it was worth. My brother Conrad and I sometimes watched them together on TV when he visited for the weekend. Both Kenny and Ellis had older parents, gray-haired mothers with wrinkles like grandmothers and old man fathers who we rarely saw, which might have explained why both boys had such an affinity for black and white movies. Whenever Kenny and Ellis performed one of their funny back and forths, and just as everyone else's laughter was dying down, one boy would ask the other who wrote his material. The answer, no matter the joke, was always Bob Hope. And every time it caused the 2 of them to grin with a private kind of pride. Mr. Samuels went on to explain that the accident hadn't been anybody's fault, and that Kenny probably hadn't felt a lot in those final moments. He and the other teachers stood together, looking out onto what must have seemed just then like a sea of the youngest, most vulnerable faces in the world. The teachers asked if any of us had questions. They encouraged us to talk about our feelings, to get things out in the open, so that nobody had to feel alone in sorting through a classmate's death. I didn't ask anything, and I didn't cry the way some of the other campers were beginning to. For a moment, I thought that I should, that it would be the decent thing for Kenny's class partner to do, but I couldn't manage it. I felt a strange detachment from myself, unable to feel what such a thing was supposed to feel like. Reality raced back at me. Hadn't Kenny sat next to me less than a week ago? Hadn't we just argued about a broken pencil and about the mess of papers threatening to spill out from his desk? How could he have been in the seat beside me one day, smelling like peanut butter or Now and Laters, and then simply be gone, disappeared, a world away? I wasn't crying, but I felt for the first time that underneath our show of not liking one another, Kenny and I had actually been friends, and it hurt. Where did death take Kenny? Did he believe, as I did, in God and heaven, or would death have carried him out of obligation somewhere else? What had it felt like just before he was gone? Did he feel it coming? Had he called out for his mother? What would I do if I knew I was about to be gone? Would I see Jesus there waiting for me just across a stream, like the Baptist hymns say? Or would everything have gone dark? And what about the blaze of warm white light people talked about? People like the man and woman I'd once seen on the episode of the Phil Donahue show about near-death experiences. I didn't let myself think about Kenny's body lying lifeless in the grass or how it would be transported home to his parents. I didn't think about whether his desk would still be there beside mine, only empty, when we returned to school. Something that wasn't any of those things sat upon my mind, making it heavy and dull, sleepy and slow. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the ride home. Watching the landscape revert to the familiar as we traveled back to Fairfield with one less child in tow, the voice in my mind muttered to itself, "At least I was there." It was a variation of the mantra with which I'd once heralded the new year, "Here I am." At least I wouldn't be in quite the same position on Monday as the one or two kids who had opted out of camp altogether, deciding instead to spend the week at home. "How was Vodka Village?" my sister Wanda asked when I walked through our front door. "Oh, it was fine," I managed, rushing past her to the bathroom. That night, a lot of it came back to me, the wide, grassy fields surrounded by oaks and pines, and how, once you stepped foot into the forest, it rang with a startling, living presence. The gophers and mountain beavers, the enormous bald eagles and flocks of honking geese, the rushing water of the creeks. I told my family about how challenging it had been to do some things, like crossing streams, by walking across a path of stones or a log balanced between one side and the other. But in the end, I'd done what had been asked of me and had been safe. None of the little feats of daring I'd been put up to in the woods had brought me to any harm. When I told my family about Kenny, it was clear from their faces that they already knew. It helped take my mind off the terrible realness of his dying by imagining that he'd probably been happy when he died, completely unconcerned, just running around in the tall grass with his friend. It helped, too, to decide that he must finally know, if he hadn't known before, how alike the two of us really were. I liked what the survivors of near-death experiences, at least the ones I'd seen that time on TV, had to say. That there was a tremendous light, warm and incomprehensibly bright, calling to them without words, and that they had raced out of their bodies and down a dark tunnel without fear, eager to be absorbed by the light that summoned. The light was alive, they'd said, and it put their minds or their hearts, whatever was left of them, at peace. The ones who had gotten closest to it before being sent back said it had felt like they were going home. Thanks. I'd forgotten that there are near-death experiences in that chapter, but it's funny, over the course of the last year or so, I found myself reading through archives of these narratives, which I think the thread that runs through many of them that has been very compelling to me is the notion that love is the animating force of the universe. People who had no sense of that as a vocabulary before these experiences sometimes had embraced this perspective. Love is the animating force of the universe, and compassion is what we're here to embody. I think that's been a really consoling mantra to have in the back of the mind during, an age when that's the opposite of what we hear most of the time. This is a book, Wade in the Water, my book that's coming out this spring, that's kind of wrestling with that question or conundrum. What would it take to actually love strangers or to love people in a truly generous way. And a lot of the poems are looking back toward history, perhaps for examples of the many ways in which we seem consistently to fail to choose compassion. And then also they're thinking in really local terms about, private experience and the ways that we do and don't regard ourselves and others with that kind of perspective. So I'm going to read to you from this book, and I'll talk a little bit about where some of the poems have come from. So there is this openness or susceptibility to the sense of like the mysterious or the numinous that I think runs through all of my work, regardless of what direction it seems to be pointed in. And that's something I wasn't really aware of until more recently. But I'll start with a poem that's really kind of going there. It's called The Angels. And it begins in probably a dream, but something that felt really real and maybe helpful. The Angels. Two slung themselves across chairs once in my motel room, grizzled in leather biker gear, emissaries for something I needed to see. I was worn down by an awful panic, a wrenching in the gut, contortions. They sat there at the table while I slept. I could sense them with a deck of playing cards between them. To think of how they smelled, what comes to mind is rum and gasoline. And when they spoke, though I couldn't, I dared not look. I glimpsed how one's teeth were ground down almost to nubs, which makes me hope some might be straight-up thugs, young, slim, raw, who bounce and roll with fearsome grace, whose very voices cause faint souls to quake. Quake then, fools, and fall away. What God do you imagine we obey? Think of the toil we must cost them, one scaled perfectly to eternity. And still they come, telling us through the ages not to fear. Just those two, that once, and never again for me since, though there are there sightings, flashes, hints, a proud tree in vivid sun, branches swaying in strong wind, rain hurling itself at the roof, boulders, mounds of earth mistaken for dead does, lions in crouch, a rust-stained pipe where a house once stood, which I take each time I pass it for an owl. Bright whirl, so dangerous and near. My mother sat whispering with it at the end of her life, while all the rooms of our house filled up with night. Thanks. I feel like there's a huge part of the sense of love, or I'm going to just call it love, that for me is pointed toward nature, or that is kind of hoping to receive something like that. Being here has really kind of activated that, the beautiful tall trees. In case you didn't gather from the little prose excerpt that I read, I'm not a skier. So I've been kind of going on the gondolas with my little kids and thinking, I'm not down there. But I get to look at all these trees with their, what feels like this abundant wisdom that they have, which is such a beautiful gift. I'll read you a couple of poems that are thinking about the planet, about the environment, in those kinds of terms. This is a really short poem. Deadly. I tell my students that any time you read a poem that is one sentence long, time is at stake. Like the question at the heart of the poem, whether it's, voiced overtly or not, has to do with time and wanting to kind of outrun it or stop it. And this is a poem that's thinking in a huge sweep of time in a really short span. Deadly. The holy thinks tiger, then watches the thing wriggle, divide, stagger up out of the sea to rise on legs and tear into the side of a loping gazelle. Thinks man, and witnesses the armies of trees and every nation of beast and the wide, furious ocean and the epochs of rock tremble. The world is your beautiful younger sister. I'm going to read the title again because it's the governing metaphor here. The world is your beautiful younger sister. Seeing her as seldom as you do, it doesn't change. The ire, the shame, the fists you must remember to smooth flat, just thinking what they did, what they promised, then took. Those men who offered to pay, to keep, the clan of them lording it over the others like high school boys and their kid brothers, men with interests to protect and mute marble wives, men who let her beam into their faces, watching her shoulders rise, her astonishing new breasts, making her believe it was she who gave permission. They plundered her youth, then moved on. Those awful, awful men, the ones whose wealth is a kind of filth. This is the title poem. There's a little story that goes with it. I was traveling in the Sea Islands in Georgia and South Carolina for a project that I'm working on. And a huge part of the marvelous and rich history in that part of the country is rooted in, the history of slavery as an institution, as a philosophy, if you will. And so it's poignant. I'd spent, several days visiting a lot of, places named Plantation, something, and a lot of unmarked sites of some really awful reality. And on the last night, I went to a ring shout, which is a musical but also a spiritual tradition in the African American community that roots back to those days of slavery, but also that has connections to West African traditions. And one of the performers, when I walked into this space, like in the lobby, said, "I love you," and she gave me a hug. I didn't know her, and I just kind of broke down in gratitude that somebody could offer something like that. And I composed myself and kind of went in. But before I got into the auditorium, I heard her say the same thing to the person behind me. And it didn't, you would think that would sort of cheapen it, but it didn't. It seemed to get amplified or magnified by that. And so this is a poem that came out of that, this idea that, I'll just read the poem. Wade in the water. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her. And a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you. I love you," as she continued down the hall past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. I love you throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. I love you in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag, until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. I love you in the water where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. I love you, the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Is this love the trouble you promised? Just to dwell a little bit longer in that history, maybe I'll read a couple of sections from a poem that I was invited to think about the Civil War a number of years ago for a photo exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. And that's not like, I don't think of that as my conflict. I don't think of it as, I'd never really thought about what that war might have felt like from the inside. And I said, okay, I've been working on prose for a long time. I should try and write a poem at this opportunity. And I said, what perspectives interest me? And I said, if I could find anything that has to do with the experience of Black soldiers during that conflict, then maybe I can write a poem based on that. So I found a couple of really wonderful books. One that included just many, many letters that Black servicemen and their families had written to Abraham Lincoln, and back and forth to each other, just asking for information about their status, asking for pay, asking for help, and locating members of their family. And then another book contained transcriptions of depositions that veterans and their widows and their descendants had given all the way into like the 20s in an attempt to get pensions that were due them. But if you think about it, slavery meant that a person who was born enslaved wouldn't have a birth certificate, wouldn't get a marriage license. Many people chose to change their names after emancipation, so there wasn't this kind of paper trail that could make it easy for people to prove their identity. So there was a lot that people lost. So this is a poem that ended up just becoming a found poem. I just sort of like curated these voices. And I'm going to read you two brief sections that are just almost like, I think of them as choruses, where many different speakers are speaking. And what I hear is a single story. The poem is called, I Will Tell You the Truth About This. I Will Tell You All About It. Excellent Sir, my son went in the 54th Regiment. Sir, my husband, who is in Company K, 22nd Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, and now in the Macon Hospital at Portsmouth with a wound in his arm, has not received any pay since last May, and then only $13. Sir, we, the members of Company D of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteers, call the attention of Your Excellency to our case. For instance, look and see that we never was freed yet, run right out of slavery into soldiery, and we hadn't nothing at all, and our wives and mother, most all of them, is a perishing all about, and we all are perishing ourself. I am willing to be a soldier and serve my time faithful like a man, but I think it is hard to be put off in such doggish manner as that. will you see that the colored men fighting now are fairly treated? You ought to do this, and do it at once, not let the thing run along. Meet it quickly and manfully. We poor oppressed ones appeal to you and ask fair play. So please, if you can do any good for us, do it in the name of God. Excuse my boldness, but please. Your reply will settle the matter and will be appreciated by a colored man who is willing to sacrifice his son in the cause of freedom and humanity. I have nothing more to say, hoping that you will lend a listening ear to an humble soldier. I will close. Yours, for Christ's sake. I shall have to send this without a stamp, for I hate money enough to buy a stamp. I am 60-odd years of age. I am 62 years of age next month. I am about 65 years of age. I reckon I am about 67 years old. I am about 68 years of age. I am on the rise of 80 years of age. I am 89 years old. I am 94 years of age. I don't know my exact age. I am the claimant in this case. I have testified before you 2 different times before. I filed my claim, I think, first about 12 years ago. I am now an applicant for pension because I understand that all soldiers are entitled to a pension. I claim pension under the general law on account of disease of eyes as a result of smallpox contracted in service. The varicose veins came on both my legs soon after the war, and the sores were there when I first put in my claim. I claim pension for rheumatism and got my toe broke, and I was struck in the side with the breech of a gun, breaking my ribs. I was a man stout and healthy, over 27 years of age when I enlisted. When I enlisted, I had a little mustache and some chin whiskers. I was a green boy right off the farm and did just what I was told to do. When I went to enlist, the recruiting officer said to me, "Your name is John Wilson." I said, "No, my name is Robert Harrison," but he put me down as John Wilson. I was known while in service by that name. I cannot read nor write, and I do not know how my name was spelled when I enlisted, nor do I know how it is spelled now. I always signed my name while in the Army by making my mark. I know my name by sound. My mother said, after my discharge, that the reason the officer put my name down as John Wilson was he could draw my bounty. I am the son of Solomon and Lucinda Sibley. I am the only living child of Dennis Campbell. My father was George Jordan, and my mother was Millie Jordan. My mother told me that John Barnett was my father. My mother was Mary Eliza Jackson, and my father Reuben Jackson. My name on the roll was Frank Nunn. No, sir, it was not Frank Nern. My full name is Dick Lewis Barnett. I am the applicant for pension on account of having served under the name Lewis Smith, which was the name I wore before the days of slavery were over. My correct name is Hiram Kirkland. Some persons call me Harry, and others call me Henry, but neither is my correct name. I think I'll close with another really brief, this is like 2 sentences, so this is a poem called The Everlasting Self, but I also, I hope we can have a conversation if you have questions, so think of a question while I'm reading this last one. The everlasting self comes in from a downpour, shaking water in every direction, a collaborative condition, gathered, shed, spread, then forgotten, reabsorbed, like love from a lifetime ago, and mud a dog has tracked across the floor. Thank you. So there are people with microphones. I'm going to let them determine who will be the first question asker. There's one down here.
Well, I love your poems, and I'm from Northern California too, so I was wondering where you were from.
Oh, I grew up in a town called Fairfield.
Oh, Fairfield.
Yeah.
We were in Marin, but I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
That's a nice question to start out with. Well, I think a lot of the things that are really truest of me come out in the poems, right? Those kind of the darker questions or the unresolvable matter that poetry helps me to wrestle with. Closer to the surface, I have 3 young kids, and that's changed my view of everything in the last 8 years since I had them. I feel so bound for, like I'm in this space with these people on top of me, and in a way, it's one of the most life-giving conditions that I could have imagined. As a writer, I feel like my sense of investment in these lives means that my work is asking bigger questions, I think, trying to understand what might we be here for. Maybe even if every poem is making a wish, which I believe it is, my wish is I want to give them something that's going to be useful to them in the world that they, kind of have to claim when I'm gone. I think probably a big part of that perspective comes from having lost my own mother at a young age. I feel like I'm preparing for what it will be like not to be here anymore. And I'm also playing with Legos and all that stuff. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, and I think it's a beautiful place, full of quiet, full of trees, full of foxes and deer that more and more are living in the poems. I lived in New York for almost 20 years, and my early poems are city poems. And now there's a vastness that I'm kind of searching for, and this other landscape is helping to give me a vocabulary for that.
As a former high school English teacher, I tried to show my students the love and the power of poetry. And I read that you're trying to go to a lot of smaller towns and kind of hopefully to renew the enthusiasm for poetry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The project that I've kind of devised or am devising through the Library of Congress is to visit smaller communities that are more remote from cities and universities. And so it's a project that's taken a little bit of time to get planned, but the first trip that I took earlier this month was to an Air Force base in Cannon Air Force Base in Corvus, New Mexico, which is a couple of hours outside of Santa Fe. My dad was in the Air Force for many years, and so there was something kind of beautifully nostalgic about going to that community and reading and talking about poems with servicemen and their spouses. And I was told that servicemen is a gender-neutral term, so everybody in the service. And even to learn that there are people who, have notebooks with them and are writing poems. I was able to record a few people reading some of their original work, which kind of affirmed this belief that I have, which is, going out there as poet laureate isn't really about bringing poetry to places where it doesn't already live, but saying, what does this conversation sound like between me and you? what can everyone learn from our two different perspectives coming together? And then I visited the Santa Fe Indian School in the city of Santa Fe. It's a really beautiful school. It was founded by the U.S. government in 1890, back when re-education for Native Americans was the goal. And then in 1920, I think, or 24, the leaders of 19 tribal communities outside of Santa Fe petitioned the government to make it an autonomous school and allow them to set the curriculum, which it now is. And so it was really beautiful to talk about poetry with students who also are thinking really deeply about language, about their own languages, preserving them, many of which are kind of dwindling or endangered. And then to listen again to poems that some of the students were writing. I think it'll be different depending on where I go, but I feel really lucky. Yeah.
Lovely poems.
Thank you.
Lovely. Could you say a few words about the gaps, the spaces between words? Generally speaking, but could you be specific about one particular poem and the way you use space?
Okay, I like that. I think poetry is language working hard to capture the inarticulable feelings, understandings, reactions that we live with. And that's why poetry, I think, comes up when somebody dies or somebody's getting married or somebody is born. That thing that wants to emerge but is hard-pressed sometimes to find the right words. Poems are trying to bridge that gap a little bit. But of course, there's always that space because language is only language. So I think there's this sense of space built into every poem, something that's unbreachable. I also, though, am really interested in all of the amazing feelings and associations that language can create. I think poems urge you to think quickly and to move deeply from one place and then lift off from that place and go to another place that's not connected in literal or linear terms. And that distance is a kind of silence. And there's a feeling that lives there. Poems gather that feeling up. And so you encounter it many, many times. I'll read you a poem of mine that is thinking about mining that a little bit deliberately. It's a poem called Ash. I'm going to have to find it. And it is the metaphor that comes up again and again is a house. It's not a poem about houses. And so I'm asking that space to do some work. And I'm asking maybe each place the poem lands in language to be a point that can be felt and then abandoned. Ash. Strange house we must keep and fill. House that eats and pleads and kills. House on legs. House on fire. House infested with desire. Haunted house. Lonely house. House of trick and suck and shrug. Give it to me, house. I need you, baby, house. House whose rooms are pooled with blood. House with hands. House of guilt. House that other houses built. House of lies and pride and bone. House afraid to be alone. House like an engine that churns and stalls. House with skin and hair for walls. House the seasons singe and douse. House that believes it is not a house. And in that poem, I feel a few things kind of like driving. One is that kind of storybook rhyme, that really simple rhyme, fills, kills, shrug, whatever. And then there's this kind of like rhythmic engine. And what I think as a poet I was listening to and kind of allowing this poem to unfold was like the things that happen when those sounds aren't happening. so there's even a lot of like space between the lines where maybe I want you to kind of like dwell a little bit as you gather this strange sense of what's being considered. Thanks for that question. Okay, so we have time for two or three more questions, I think.
So this kind of goes with the past question where you're talking about the meaning of poetry, but over the past couple of years, I've noticed a rise of Instagram poets with poems that are usually pretty short, and you can kind of get them as you scroll through, and you don't have to spend as long connecting. So thinking about both that gentleman's question about how we as a country connect, and then where you're talking about connecting to different spaces, both as a university professor and as our poet laureate, what does that mean for us as a country?
Nice. I think, my real wish is that whatever the source, that language, thoughtful and courageous language, is something that can turn us inward a little bit. So if there's a poem on Instagram that's coming from a real place and that's speaking in useful terms for someone to what it feels like to be alive, and that's something that person can use as an excuse to sort of slow down, maybe like close the browser for a minute and just kind of like think, what does it feel like to be here? Then I think that's really wonderful. When you talk about really short poems, I think, every poem is full of like really short things that can live with you forever. Even detached from their context, there are little views of the world or phrases that capture a sense of thought or feeling that kind of don't go away once you've read them. I don't know why, sometimes it's when I'm on escalators, but there's a poem by the poet Thomas James, who died about 40 years ago, and it's a poem about a mummy, a young girl who's narrating what it feels like to be mummified, and she says, I was so important, and they did all of these things, but then at the end of the poem, obviously she's dead, something has happened, and so the last line of the poem swerves away from this narrative of being made immortal, and she asks, why do people lie to one another? And something, that's a question that pops up at strange times. And I think, my lifetime of reading poems has given me thousands of those little moments that are useful in unexpected occasions. And I hope that Instagram, if that's the source, is giving that to people. I know books can do that too. So my mission is to get out there with books, not just my own, and say these are some of the voices that you can live with forever. Which is really just a way of saying voices that can help you listen to yourself better. Yeah. How about one last question?
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm here with my son, Tyler, he and I were up till midnight talking about a book I'm reading that I've read for the second time in my life. 50 years ago, Black Like Me, John Griffin. And when you speak of poetry, and then you just spoke of books and things that have affected you, we had a disagreement about whether that book would be able to be accepted in today's society, because it's almost so cutting edge that it's even more cutting edge now than it was 50 years ago, in that the white man doesn't want to know about himself, and the black people don't want to know about themselves. Do you feel that book could make a comeback, or is my son right that it probably would not work?
Well, there's a book that was written, that came out about 4 or 5 years ago by a novelist named Jess Rao, called Your Face and Mine. And I'm going to start by saying that and then interrupt myself and say I've actually never read Black Like Me. and then go back to Jess Rao, which is in some ways kind of a retelling, I think, of that narrative. It's a book that imagines a time in the near future when a thing called racial reassignment surgery is something that people can elect to have. And I think it's a way of saying, I don't think it's a way of saying I want to change sides. I think it's a way of saying I want to invest in other lives differently, and maybe crossing a line will allow that to happen, but it also means surrendering something. I know that our conversation in America about race is not done, and so I imagine that, even the fact that you're talking about that book means it's useful in some way to where we are now, or the fact that someone is kind of borrowing some of the impetus that might have set a book like that in motion to write a story that's set, in the 21st and a half century, suggests we have a lot of questions, and we also have a lot of fear and curiosity about what it is like on the other side of these racial lines. So I think it's probably something we're going to be thinking and arguing about, hopefully, more, because I think that's the only way that we can better hear each other, or better wonder about each other, which is probably even more important. Okay, thank you very much.